Is being married or in a relationship a financial net positive? Do men really earn or save more money when they're living with or married to a woman? This week I ran across an ABC News segment about what they called the Gen Z romance recession. Now, this is financial journalist Kristen Myers, who was part of that discussion, and her message was simple. Young people are dating less, and money is a major cause. Here's just a couple of lines from that story.
Gen Z singles, they're facing a romance recession. Dating has become too expensive.
It's both money and then also a little bit of dating fatigue. Being in a relationship is financially beneficial.
As they stated, dating apps cost money. Entertainment, drinks, and dinner are all expensive. You can live in a big city and spend easily $200 or $300 on a date with somebody that you'll never see again. Fair enough. That can add up very quickly, especially when the cost of living is so high like it is today and in an uncertain job market. But then the conversation took a turn that caught my attention. That while dating can be expensive, relationships can actually save you money, like splitting bills and splitting rent. Yes, that's reasonable, and that's why many people choose to live with roommates. But then Myers went further.
Married couples, they end up making more money. And frankly, marriage tends to be an economic, particularly for men, it tends to be an economic tailwind for them. So being in a partnership is definitely a net positive thing for most people, especially financially.
She said that married couples make more money, and marriage in particular tends to be and she said it, economic tailwind for men. She summed it up by saying partnership is definitely a net positive, especially financially. And that's a much larger claim, and it's what we're going to dive in today. I wanted to find out how much truth there is to her statements, so I went deep diving. It's not that marriage doesn't sometimes save money or that a good marriage can't be financially valuable. I actually agree with those statements. The point here is that if we're going to use financial terms like those of Myers, that like tailwind and net positive, then I think we should consider all aspects rather than just looking at the financial state of married couples themselves. So here's how this is going to play out in today's discussion. First, I'll give marriage the strongest financial case that I can. And then we'll look at the famous male marriage wage premium and whether marriage actually causes it. And from there, we'll follow the money inside households, especially those of married couples. And then we'll get into the part that I think started to look like the biggest financial issue of all, exiting the investment. We'll also look at a couple of other things along the way, but those are the major parts. And somewhere through all of it, we'll get to the truth of the matter.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
My name is Todd, and I review research and get to the truth of topics like this that are relevant to men. So if that's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. We're closing in on 10,000 subscribers, and I would love for you to be one of them. So let's start with the obvious marriage benefit. Two people can do some things more cheaply together than all by themselves. Married and cohabitating couples, they don't need 4 televisions, 2 internet connections, and phone plans. They don't need 10 streaming services or 2 separate apartments. Sometimes they don't even need 2 vehicles. If 2 people both have an $1,800 apartment, moving into a single $2,500 place can save a lot of money, even if they split it evenly. And they probably also get a lot more room, like an extra bedroom to boot. Now, that's not a bad deal. They're both saving anywhere, I guess, from $500 to $2,000 a month each, and they have more space. Economists call this economies of scale. Now, let me set this up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data have shown real per-person savings for married couples in areas such as housing and utilities. Marriage can also reduce individual risk. If one spouse loses a job, for example, the other can hopefully support the household or at least keep it afloat for a while. One spouse may also have better or less expensive health insurance. There's also retirement, inheritance, and tax advantages for some couples. And if both spouses earn even decent incomes, finances can look pretty good. 2 people each earning $60,000, for example, is a total of $120,000 of income. When they eliminate duplicate expenses, they can save more aggressively and build assets together, which is a real financial advantage. And then there's the widely proclaimed statistic that makes this case look even better for men in particular. Married men earn more. Economists have been reporting this for decades, and they call it the male marital wage premium or marriage wage premium. So this is the story that Kristen Myers, back from ABC in that news footage, this is what she was referring to in that segment. Marriage cuts some expenses, it pools risk, as I mentioned, and the husband himself apparently starts earning more. But that last part is where things get interesting. What about that marriage wage premium? It turns out that it's not some internet myth. There is some serious research behind it. One famous American Economic Review article, right up here on the screen, from 2004, assessed that if married men earn more, then maybe men who marry are simply different. Maybe they were more disciplined, healthier, or better connected. But those authors wondered, perhaps comparing twins could make the comparison more accurate. So they analyzed identical twin brothers in which one was married and the other wasn't. Because identical twins, as you would imagine, they share genetics and the same upbringing, this was intended to control for the idea that, quote, better men are simply more likely to marry. And in that twins study, the married twins' wage advantage was even higher than the 19% found in the general population, which led to the conclusion that being selected for marriage alone probably couldn't explain the marriage wage premium, and that marriage itself might not be contributing to higher earnings. Basically, they argued that the wage gap didn't happen just because more successful men were more likely to marry. And there are plausible reasons. For example, maybe men work more hours or multiple jobs after getting married. Couples may create specialized roles within the house, with women doing more housework, so he can invest more time in paid outside labor, thereby increasing his career and his earnings. Some newer work also argues that marriage itself raises men's earnings. So I don't want to pretend that the literature and some legitimate sources say the marriage premium doesn't exist, because they absolutely do. But other researchers asked, what were these men's wages and what were they doing before they got married? So let's begin here with this example. Imagine two 35-year-old men. One got married a few months ago, and he earns $100,000 a year. The other is single, and he earns $70,000 a year. Marriage looks pretty good at this point, and with this single data point, it supports the marriage premium. But let's rewind 10 years. Mr. $100,000 was already moving fast. 10 years earlier, he was earning $45,000, then $55,000, and then $68,000, and finally to $100,000 over the preceding decade. He was getting promotions and his career was taking off. And then he marries and continues on, earning $150,000 5 years after getting married. Mr. $70,000 a year started in the same earnings neighborhood about 10 years ago, but his earnings grew more slowly because he's the type that likes to live a more chill life. He decided to stay single and ultimately earns less than half of his married counterpart. So did the wedding create the trajectory, or did the trajectory help create the wedding? A 2017 demography paper shows that results were most consistent with men marrying while their wages were already rising faster. And, get this, divorcing while their wage trajectories were already deteriorating. They also found no causal marriage effect on wages. Now, other researchers revisited this a year later. At first, they found the same thing. Married men earned more. But then they looked at how men's wages were changing before marriage and how things changed. The men who went on to marry were already seeing faster wage growth before the marriage. And once that was accounted for, the apparent marriage premium totally disappeared. So when we compare these more recent reports to the twin study and others that do find a marriage wage premium, we uncover a real discrepancy. The story that we often hear, just like that one on ABC in that news segment,
being in a partnership is definitely a net positive, particularly for men. It tends to be an economic tailwind.
Is that married men earn more. But that may be irresponsible to take the entire earnings gap, rubber stamp it as a marriage benefit, and simply move on. Now let's move outside the wage studies and look at the marriage market itself. Who does get married? Well, Census Bureau data show that economic security is related to marriage among young adults. More specifically, full-time employment, wages, and home ownership are all associated with higher marriage rates. And then there are the expectations that people openly admit. For example, in 2017, Pew Research asked Americans what determines being a good husband or partner. 71% said that it's very important for a man to support a family financially. For a woman, it was 32% for her to support a family. Both sexes were just as likely to say that financial provision was very important for a man. Even among younger adults, the expectation was still much more evident for men. Now, at this point, I want to still acknowledge that none of this proves that women only care about money. It doesn't tell us what any single woman values, and people marry for all kinds of reasons. But the pattern is starting to support a much less flattering possibility than the usual marriage premium story. Men are judged much more heavily on financial provision. Economic security is associated with marriage, and men on stronger wage trajectories are more likely to get married. So here's my interpretation from what we've covered so far, not just a single study. Maybe marriage isn't directly responsible for men's earnings. Or more bluntly, maybe money isn't the reward that men receive from marriage. Maybe it's part of the price of admission. But let's move on and follow the money. Suppose a guy gets married. Who likely earns the money in that marriage? In 2022, Pew analyzed census data on opposite-sex marriages. And in 29% of marriages, husbands and wives earned roughly the same amount. In 16% of the marriages, the wife was a primary or sole breadwinner. So that leaves 55% in which the husband was the primary or sole breadwinner. So in a majority of marriages, the man still provides between 60 and 100% of the couple's income. Across those marriages, median earnings were about $65,000 for husbands and $35,000 for wives. In marriages where the husband was a primary provider, the typical husband earned around $96,000, while the wife earned around $30,000. So let's actually use that couple as an example. He makes $96,000 and she makes $30,000. The household has a $126,000 of earned income. Then somebody points to that couple and they say, see, marriage is financially good for him. Look how much money that married couple has over there in their household. But hold on, about 3/4 of that earned income came from him. If his career trajectory were already producing $96,000, that money is not evidence of what the marriage gave him. In fact, it may be evidence of what he gave the marriage. And now several pieces are starting to fit together. Men on stronger economic trajectories marry more often. Men still face the higher provider expectation. Husbands remain the primary earners in most marriages. Then the resulting household income gets cited as evidence that marriage made men financially successful. Maybe the man isn't receiving the marriage premium that we hear about. Maybe, at least in part, he is the marriage premium. Let's move on to, let's call this the accounting problem. There's another missing piece in this discussion. Before marriage, we talk about men's income, his savings, his retirement account, and his net worth. After marriage, we start talking about household income and household wealth. Now, those are useful measures, of course, but they're certainly not the same thing. Let's consider this hypothetical example. A single man earns $150,000. After taxes and living expenses, let's suppose that he can save $50,000 a year if he lives modestly. Then he marries a woman who's earning $20,000 during the marriage. Their household income rises to $170,000 a year, which seems wealthy on paper. But now the household includes 2 adults. Maybe they buy a larger home or a second car. Food, vacation, insurance, home furnishings, and other expenses all increase. Now, to be sure, the couple experiences economies of scale that I mentioned earlier, but the second adult is not free, not by any means. And now the household saves $40,000 a year jointly instead of the $50,000 that he was saving when he was by himself. So the proper comparison shouldn't be married households versus Mr. Average Single Guy. It should be this man while he's married versus that same man if he were unmarried. Now, let me take a step back and acknowledge that a wife who earns little or nothing financially can contribute economic value. I want to be absolutely fair here. For example, she's doing childcare, housework, and other things that support him in the house and helps to free him so he can focus on his career and earn more income. So in complete honesty and transparency, she earns zero, so therefore she contributes nothing. That's not completely fair. It's not completely true. Fine. Count the unpaid labor, count the shared living expenses, share the tax advantages, and any real wage increases that the marriage might help with. But if we're going to do that, then we have to include everything else too. Because when we're talking about incomes and finances, the word net doesn't mean just include the benefits and then stop. And this is where the accounting problem really shifts. Incomes and expenses are not the only thing that can change. So can debt. This study right up here using Federal Reserve data compared debt across different family structures. Let's take a look at this. About 76% of childless married couples had debt, compared with 64% of single men. The difference was particularly large for mortgages, in which 49% of childless married couples had mortgage debt, compared to just 23% of single men without children. Vehicle loans showed a similar pattern, about 36% compared to 21%. And among married couples with children, the numbers were even higher. 91% had some kind of debt, 65% had mortgage debt, 52% had credit card debt, and about half had a vehicle loan. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that getting married forced any guy to borrow the money or to get into debt. And it certainly doesn't prove that his wife demanded that he take on the debt or to buy things. But I think that it does show that the liability side of the marriage is an investment strategy looks very different across family structures. And that's important because the same guy may have preferred to be perfectly happy living in a smaller house or a condo or an apartment, driving his paid off car for another 5 years, and paying off his credit cards every month. Would this particular man have taken on all of those obligations if he had remained single? The truth is that we don't know. But it's the counterfactual information that we need if we're going to call marriage a financial net positive for him. Now listen, any investment can look great when we only measure the years in which it increased in value. The real test is what happens when you get out of the investment. Now this is the exit clause that's never included in the marriage premium discussion that people have. In marriage, that exit clause is called divorce. And it's not some microscopic financial event like 1.5% fees to withdraw your own money from the investment early. In 2023, CDC data show that there were more than 670,000 divorces in 45 states that reported, which also included Washington, D.C. Now, that rate has fallen over time, which is worth noting, but hundreds of thousands of marriages still end every year with this exit clause. And this is the part that I think gets almost completely left out when people tell men that marriage is a
Economic tailwind.
Let's put this into a financial investment example. If a stock rises 10% a year, but includes the probability that getting rid of it cuts your wealth in half, do we evaluate the investment only by the years it increased in value? Absolutely not. That would be dishonest and probably land somebody in jail. So we must also price the risk of an investment. And as you would imagine, there's research on this as well. In 2005, Jay Zagorski, who was then at Ohio State University, used longitudinal data to track wealth across marriage and divorce. His findings included that married respondents accumulated wealth faster than singles. That's what we hear all the time. And that's the pro-marriage side of the story. But divorced respondents reported an average wealth drop of 77%. And get this staggering detail. The decline began years before the divorce itself. Let me repeat that. Respondents' 77% wealth drop, those that got divorced, began years before divorce. And that same study is often used to support the wealth advantages associated with marriage. But it also found an enormous wealth collapse around divorce. Some wealth disappears because one household is breaking into two. Savings may already be falling during a troubled marriage, and in some instances, people may use liquid cash or liquidate other assets to afford separate housing, legal help, moving expenses, and many other things. But from the perspective of whether marriage is a good financial investment for men, none of those matters regarding the final result, reduced wealth. If the marriage ends and his net worth is dramatically lower afterward, it's the investment risk, which results from the exit clause. Now, unlike a stock, the exit isn't simply sell your shares and keep whatever they're worth. Divorce laws vary by state, and let's be 100% honest here. None of this means that women automatically get half of men's assets. Separate property can remain separate, and property division isn't always 50-50. But wealth can build during the marriage, including home equity, retirement benefits, investments, and sometimes business interests. And they're all often part of that exit clause, along with debt and probable support obligations, which I'm not going to get into here for simple brevity. So losing everything, if we're very honest, doesn't mean literally losing every dollar. It can mean having nearly every major part of the wealth that you spent decades building exposed at the same time. That's true. And as an additional part of that exit clause, remember that additional debt that married couples have over single men? The CFPB states that divorce does not necessarily release someone from a jointly signed debt. Even if a divorce decree assigns the debt to a former spouse, a creditor can generally still pursue someone whose name remains on the loan or the account unless that creditor releases them from the debt or it's refinanced. So now let me give the strongest counter argument, because there are marriages that can look fine and even excellent financially. A man earning $100,000 marries a woman earning $90,000. Let's start there. They both keep working, they share one home, they control their spending, and they support each other's careers, stay married for 40 years, maybe 50, and they build a lifetime of assets together. That can be a tremendous economic partnership. In another example, let's say she earns less, but she takes on childcare and household work that lets him build a career that he couldn't have built while doing half of everything at home. Her contribution may be worth far more than the salary that she gave up in the form of his increased earnings. And if the marriage lasts, then much exit risk never materializes. So let's be honest, we can't always say that the wife earns less and therefore the husband loses. The argument is that the financial outcome depends tremendously on who you marry, what both people contribute, how the household spends, how assets are entitled and treated under the law, and whether the marriage lasts, among many other things. Which is exactly what the belief that married men earn more dismisses in the financial tailwind story. In fact, let's go one step further and extend the discussion into the financial language that Kristen Myers explained it in, from the very basics.
It's both money and then also a little bit of dating fatigue. Being in a relationship is financially beneficial. Married couples, they end up making more money. And frankly, marriage tends to be an economic, particularly for men, it tends to be an economic tailwind for them. So being in a partnership is definitely a net positive thing for most people, especially financially.
Marriage is not a stock or a bond. Calling it an investment is a metaphor. But once somebody tells men that marriage is a financial net positive or a tailwind, the metaphor is fair game as far as I'm concerned. So if we're going to evaluate marriage like an investment, we should evaluate it the same way we would any other major financial commitment, with 6 parts of the investment realities. First, required capital. Men face a strong expectation to have capital before marriage. Second is cash flow. The husband remains the primary or sole earner. Third, return on investment. These include shared expenses and savings, maybe second income, some tax and legal benefits, and other benefits of marriage. Fourth is ownership. Wealth accumulated during marriage exists inside a legal contract. It's not the same as the man's personal wealth. Number 5, exit risk. Divorce can divide property and retirement assets. It can force changes to housing. It can allocate debt to both parties and lead to a myriad of other wealth-reducing outcomes. Number 6 is opportunity cost. What would this same man have done with the same earnings, the same time, and his own same capital if he had remained unmarried? Without that counter argument, we cannot calculate his true financial return from marriage. Yes, we can observe that the married men earn more. That's true, in fact, and that married households have more combined wealth. Of course, that's also true. But none of that explains that marriage made him wealthier. So here's the uncomfortable part. For years, men have been told a story that sounds promising, if not even flattering. Settle down, get married, build a life together. You'll earn more. Married men are more successful. Marriage is good for you financially. And there may be some truth in it. But maybe you don't get the woman and then become financially secure. Maybe becoming financially secure is one of the things that gets you the woman. Again, in all honesty, women don't have to consciously calculate a man's lifetime earnings for that pattern to exist. And I'll even argue that, even on a grand scale, many guys take pride in having the income that allows them to get the wife. There's nothing wrong with that. No one needs to be a villain here. People respond to security, preferences, and incentives in many different ways. A woman may simply prefer a guy who has his life together. The guy himself may not feel ready to marry until he can provide. Those ordinary decisions seem to produce the same aggregate pattern. Economically stronger men marry more often. Again, nothing necessarily wrong with that. And if that's part of what's happening, then the higher earning married man is not in and of itself evidence that marriage led to his increased wealth. He may, in fact, be evidence that success helped the marriage be possible at all. And then once he's inside the marriage, the economic value he was already producing becomes household value, while the possibility of divorce places a meaningful share of that household wealth at risk. So let's go back to that ABC segment for just a moment. Young adults are supposedly backing away from dating because dinners cost too much. And the truth is, yes, dating is expensive. But shacking up saves money and married couples earn more. But after looking at the evidence, I think that story is far too simple. Yes, couples can have and save more money by sharing a household. Count that, yeah. And yes, wives can contribute income and substantial unpaid labor. Yeah, let's count that too. And yes, some research supports that marriage itself may increase men's wages. Let's go ahead and count that as well. But that's where it ends. Because we also need to count the other aspects. Count the marriage selection. Men on stronger earnings trajectories are more often likely to marry. We have to count the provider expectation. Americans still expect and judge men much more heavily on their ability to support a family financially. And we also have to then count the cash flow. Husbands are still the primary or sole earners in most opposite-sex marriages. We also have to include the accounting switch from his income and his assets to household income and household wealth. And above all, we have to include the exit costs, division of assets and savings, loss of home equity and retirement. There's the legal and court costs, alimony and support. There's also increased debt responsibility, even if it's not his. And we're not even talking about the social benefits of being single compared to the obligations of time and other resources that marriage requires. Not even touching on that. Having said all that, then compared the married man with the man who actually matters, himself, had he not married. That's the calculation that we never get. So when somebody tells me that married men earn more and therefore marriage is a financial net positive for them, I think that they've skipped the most important parts of the whole equation. What did marriage actually add that the man wasn't already going to produce himself? And what portion of what he produced remains his after the marriage fails? If he already had a satisfying job and income that was not building debt, don't credit the wedding for the promotions or increased net worth. If he supplies most of the household income, don't point to the household income as evidence that somebody enriched him. If his earnings built marital assets, don't say that every dollar on the household balance sheet is his to keep. And if the arrangement can end with losing just half of the house, retirement, the savings, the years of accumulated wealth as part of the exit, don't call it a financial net positive without pricing that risk. A good marriage may be one of the best life decisions that some men ever make. I get it. I'm not here to argue about that. It may give him lifelong family, children, companionship, meaning of life, and things that no investment account could ever buy. But that's not the same as whether marriage is a good financial investment. If we're judging it only on money and being a financial tailwind, particularly for men who enter with assets and earn substantially more than his partner, the financial outlook is very different than when we include the exit. As I mentioned, maybe marriage didn't create his value. Maybe his value created an opportunity to get married. And then once he is married, the value that he kept producing became household wealth that's later divided rather than keeping his wealth to himself. So maybe the famous adage, the old line about male marriage premium, isn't telling men what they stand to gain from marriage. Looking at it from a more accurate angle, it's actually about what they already had to offer. And if you want to know whether marriage made a guy wealthier, don't just show me his paycheck while he's married. Show me what his income and his debt looked like before the marriage and after it ends. Then we can talk about the return. Thanks a lot for sticking to the end. Give me your thoughts, and I'll see you soon.